We make a claim here that we must get much more systemic about the problems that face our rangelands. And the first question you'll want to know is, where are the rangelands? This figure here with the heavy line shows 4/5 of Australia with very variable rainfall and therefore variable production. The heavy line dictates the rangelands, and the different patterns within there are classified as remote and very remote areas from a socio-economic point of view. The graph down below, the stipple over that same map is the areas that are currently grazed by mainly cattle and sometimes sheep. So why are we worried about the rangelands? Well, 4/5 of the Australian continent, it's fallen off the policy agenda. Services have retreated. There's also always a catastrophe out there. It's always governed from far away. The capital cities always have a lot to say about the rangelands, but they're never there. And my point already is that we have to plan ahead and do it in a very ordered and systemic way to make some headway. The numbers of people out there, generally think about 400,000 people live in the rangelands. That has decreased between the census, between 2001 and 2016. It's gone down by about 50,000. And of that, now 394,000 people, about 109,000 are Indigenous. And so that's somewhere nearly approaching a third of the population in the rangelands are Indigenous. They are tending to have a younger age structure, whereas the non-Indigenous population are tending to be older. The land use. This is over 6 million square kilometres of Australia. Nearly 4/5 of Australia are rangelands. The graph there shows that just over half of it is grazed or is said to be grazed. Another 15% and 19% are in different sorts of Indigenous ownership, and 11% is in conservation national parks, and a minute amount is defence land. But when we go through the overall who owns what, it now appears that around 61% over a variety of 10-year types are in Indigenous ownership. The production, well, a lot of money comes out of the rangelands, over $100 billion. And as you'd guess, this is mainly mining. But when you take that slice out of the pizza there and look at the things apart from mining, then cattle are about 5 billion, tourism about 3, and sheep and kangaroos and bush foods and so about a billion. So it's not an insubstantial area, but most of it is mining, and of that mining, most is iron ore. The cattle numbers are somewhere around 8 million cattle. The bottom graph shows the sheep have declined from somewhere around 14 million back in the year 2000 to around 4 million now. So it's predominantly, of the grazing land, it's predominantly cattle. Now, talking about a few insights into what goes on in the rangelands, let's talk first about the southern rangelands. They are very generally, if you extend the Queensland-New South Wales border right across to Western Australia, the area below that would be called the southern rangelands. These have been grazed and managed for somewhat 150 years. There always seems to have been, over the time scale, that there always seems to have been a major problem, a major government intervention, thinking about that. So we have 150 years of European history. However, new land uses are emerging, carbon and conservation, private conservation. And the other thing to note that when we're talking about management, in inverted commas, of the rangelands, then at least half of the grazing pressure of the southern rangelands is unmanaged. That's mainly goats and mainly kangaroos. So if we look to increasing the ecological worth of the southern rangelands, then we've got to be able to do something about that unmanaged grazing pressure. The northern rangelands are typified by what we call a two-speed system. Big corporates are in there in a big way in a lot of big and very potentially productive grazing stations. However, there are also a whole lot of marginal ones as well, so we refer to it as a two-speed pastoral economy. There is also, with the wish Australians have to create dams, there are sites in the northern rangelands for over 80 large dams and over 1 million hectares of potentially irrigable land. And of course, one of the major ecological issues across the northern rangelands are invasive plants, gamba grass, buffel grass, prickly acacia, and many, many more. Think about Indigenous Australia, and we have no easy answers here, of course, except to say that development must equal modernisation, but minus the dependency which has happened over the last 100 years. We've already noted that 28% of the rangeland population is Indigenous versus 3% for Australia as a whole, and 61% of land ownership over a range of tenure types is Indigenous. And so that any future we talk about of the rangeland has got to have a very strong Indigenous component and Indigenous management component. So getting around to what we think of the big issues that transcend these large numbers of issues, problems, opportunities, and so on. We, in this study we conducted over the last couple of years, came out with 5, just to try and get people's mind as to not a never-ending list of issues. So the social licence to operate, the fact that the population is Indigenous, and that Indigenous component is getting younger and therefore requires jobs. Technology opportunities, but there are also many technology threats. The governance and capital leakage, and also the human capacity and capability of the rangelands is a key issue if we are to try and manage properly 4/5 of Australia. So I'll only deal with 2 of those. The social licence to operate, you won't have to watch the media over the last 3 or 4 months and note the blowing up of gorges by Rio and the Pilbara and so on creates a huge issue worldwide. And so the various images I put up there are just somewhere if we are to create enterprise in the rangelands, both the northern and the southern rangelands, then social licence to operate is a key thing. Mining and mining rehabilitation, live trade of sheep and cattle, the prospect of tourism enterprises there and whether they are aiding or detracting from enterprises and social work in the areas. The whole area of Indigenous ownership and product, have a picture there of Indigenous art, and the key question in a social licence to operate issue is whether the economic worth and social worth of that product actually gets back to the people that produce it. Another photo down there of sandalwood harvesting, a key issue in some areas of the Australian rangelands, kangaroos and their use. And of course, just to note that the Australian beef industry has a very strong sustainability framework. These are all swirling issues that have to be solved within the rangelands, but are strongly impacted. There are strong comments coming from outside the rangelands as to what is going on there. And those attitudes and those political forces from outside the rangelands could very well stymie activities that are going on in the rangeland, whether they be worthwhile or not seen as worthwhile. Technology opportunities and threats. Certainly in the study we conducted, we saw, of course, it's very hard to ignore the wonderful things that technology has brought us, and some of the images there of John Flemley's pedal radio versus the flying doctor service now flying into wherever to pick up an injured worker. The photos of the old-fashioned Jenny set that you used to use to give yourself a little bit of electricity versus the solar and battery setup and so on. But the key thing we say, opportunities and threats, because the more we introduce technologies into these areas, the more we tend to, we can disempower the local people. During COVID lockdown, I'm sure we've all had our opportunity to undergo the delights of telehealth and so on. But if you live in a regional area in the rangelands, then there is nothing better than to have a real doctor, a real nurse, a real hospital, a real clinic, rather than just relying on telehealth. And so bringing many of these things together, our call for a systemic approach to this, we've tried to bring together in what we call a Herandogram here, but it's basically an aid memoir to take us through whatever issue we're facing in management and dealing with problems in the rangelands. It's good to go through a checklist and see where you can intervene. So typical of the rangelands, 4/5 of Australia, as we've noted, climate variability, which means there is a low and variable production. Some years, this production is wonderful, and one would think, why doesn't it go on forever? On the other side, there are extremely limited livelihoods and scarce capital. If you're talking about getting capital applied to the rangelands, of course, a tunnel under the Sydney Harbour is always going to get first choice. But then when you bring both the climate variability and the livelihoods, you're faced with a sparse population, only around 400,000 people over 4/5 of Australia. How to get people to where the issue is and get it dealt with is a key issue. There's the question then tracking down through that everywhere is remote. We're not talking just about mobile phones, but getting there physically. The communications over many of these areas are almost as bad as they were 10 or 15 years ago. And allied with all of that is the social uncertainty of trying to deal with these issues. And somehow we have to underpin that social uncertainty and make it more certain so that people stay there and skills stay there. And of course, the feedback arrow going up, that loops around and round that diagram, and the blue boxes on either side, I won't go into them in full detail, but they're sort of intervention points. But as you're having a looping around of these issues, we have to decide and choose and underpin strong intervention points that intervene with strength and are persistent if we are to improve the lot of the rangelands. So in summary, to think about dealing with 4/5 of Australia and dealing with it systemically, I guess we note that there are only modest human numbers in the rangelands, that the knowledge base is very much the same for all of the land users and all of the enterprises there, whether it be Indigenous use, pastoralism, conservation, mining, bush foods, and so on. It's the same intellectual, ecological understanding of landscapes, plants, animals, climate, and so on. It's unlikely that there's going to suddenly happen there to be a macro institution that deals with 4/5 of Australia, so we have to take that into consideration. Our governance of the rangelands needs to be regional. It needs to be consistent and comprehensive. However, we've got to be ready for, with well-laid plans, to rapidly take up a lot of money that may be parachuted onto a particular region. And I'll finish with that in a minute. I've made the point we've got to be ensure that technologies mostly help and don't depopulate and disempower rangelands communities, and that being pragmatic and more than pragmatic, the only way ahead for the rangelands for 4/5 of Australia is that there has to be an embrace of shared cultures, given the strong Indigenous ownership of land there, that they are a growing population there. And how we do that is one of the challenges, the biggest challenge we see in the rangelands. And so, in conclusion, I've been asked to think of one thing that we could take ahead in the rangelands, and for the authors of the study, and there were many of them, I think it is to develop, for each region, to develop a plan, a systemic plan that sort of assumes that $50 million is going to be parachuted onto a region, and rather than start thinking then, what are we going to do with this money, we almost have to have a list of 5 or 10 issues to deal with. So a systemic plan ready for an intervention of private and public money to deal with some crisis, some issue that comes up in the rangelands. And I think that is the way ahead. If I had a second opportunity of a must-do it is that the skills base in the rangelands is declining at a worrying level as key people leave. And so to think about the key skills that you need to underpin rangelands management in all of the land uses I've talked about, that would be a second major thing that we should be doing. Thank you.